It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom with 3 administrators over them, one who was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself amongst the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." And I want to point something out there that, so Daniel, I don't know how many of us would think about God's calling on our lives and think, oh, I know, God is going to press me into political service for one of the kingdoms of our enemies, right? And then if you were maybe pressed into service for one of the kingdoms of the enemies of the people of God, you might think, oh, I know, I'll go there to like sabotage it from within, right? But Daniel, he kept getting elevated to positions of authority because of his skill at running the kingdom on behalf of the Babylonians and then the Persians, right? And he had enemies. It's not super clear exactly why these people didn't like him, although I think it probably just boiled down to they didn't like him because he was a foreigner. It seems like that's the reason. And they were trying to find something wrong with his ability, with his skill, and they couldn't find anything. Yeah.
I think it also indicates that I think it's partly because he was uncorruptible.
Yeah.
Some of them wanted to be corrupted.
That's probably a good point too. Just sheer power-hungry people wanting to be able to exercise power for their own ends, and Daniel wouldn't go along to get along. Yeah, no, that's great. So it's something to note about Daniel, right? This is somebody who's skilled in his work, right? So verse 6, so these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king, and they said, "May King Darius live forever." So be wary of people who come to you praising you. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it into writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. So again, right, when people come praising you and lifting you up and telling you how great you are, that doesn't necessarily mean they have your best interests at heart. So when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and they spoke to him about the royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." And so just a little historical note. In many ancient kings had no law that was higher than them, right? And so this happens to be a kingdom in which there is actually a law higher than the king, right? And so the king is actually being held to a standard here. And they tricked the king, right? They tricked him into doing something that he didn't want to do that's going to end up being bad for Daniel. And another thing to point out is, so Daniel's not throwing his faith in the face of his neighbors, and yet he's also not hiding his faith from his neighbors, right? He's publicly a man of God, but also he's not going out of his way to throw his faith in his neighbors' faces. And so I think that's something interesting to note about the way Daniel lives his life, right? We'll come back to that at some point this morning. Where were we? Verse 13. Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius, and they said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den, and when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted out from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lion overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and the people of every language in the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So that's our passage today. And I think, you can go to the next slide. I think this story, there's a lot in this story that we could chew on together. In many ways, it's a story of God's powerful, miraculous saving action on Daniel's part, right? It's also a story of courageous faith on Daniel's part. But that sermon Zach's actually going to preach next Sunday, so you guys get to hear the story about fear and courage and trusting in God in the midst of crazy, perilous circumstances. But today, what I really wanted to focus in on is, this is Labor Day weekend. I wanted to talk a little bit about Daniel's career, right? And as Janine pointed out, Daniel probably didn't envision himself. Maybe he thought he would be a politician. He probably didn't think he was going to be a Babylonian politician growing up, right? And maybe he envisioned that his life would have some hardships, but I can't imagine that he saw himself being thrown in a lion's den. I can't imagine he saw himself facing some of the kinds of things that he had to face, right? And so, but I want to delve into, the work of Daniel, right? And actually, we can go to the next slide. Right, so this idea of vocation, I love that picture, by the way. That's a fun picture. So the first few chapters of Genesis, all right, I'll step back even before that. So in the Vineyard movement, a phrase that gets tossed around a lot is that we were made to worship, this idea that human beings were designed to worship God. The Westminster Confession says that the chief end of man is to enjoy God and glorify him forever, or to glorify God and enjoy him forever. I can't remember the exact order, right? And it's this idea that we were made to worship God. And that is true. Both of those statements are true, but I would actually argue that they're incomplete, right? When we read through the beginning of Scripture, we see that God definitely made us to be in a relationship with him where we would glorify him and enjoy him. That is absolutely a part of our calling, our vocation, our identity as human beings. But he also gave us work to do, right? And that's the other half of the equation. So at the very beginning, he made Adam and Eve, and he put them on the earth, and he said, take care of the place, right? And that is still the mandate to human beings. And so we're called to worship, but we're also called to work, right? And that is one of the most important ways, certainly not the only way. Don't hear me say that. But one of the most important ways that we serve God is through the work that we do, right? And that oftentimes, but not always, is the work that we get paid to do, our jobs, but it can be other things too, right? There definitely are people who have a deep sense of vocation and calling to raise kids or to be a homemaker or even to do things outside of their paid profession, right? There are all sorts of ways that God can give us some sort of work or purpose, but that's just as much a part of our human identity and our human calling and our human purpose as worship is. And so both of those things go together, right? And so I want to just dig into that a little bit, that idea that God made us. I mean, he made us for relationship with him. He made us for relationship with each other. He made us for honor and purpose, but he also made us for work, right? And he gave us a job to do. Yeah. So in this story, Daniel, he has a clear sense of purpose. He has a clear sense of calling. He has a clear sense of vocation. But he also runs into real trouble, right? And again, this harkens back to the first few chapters of Genesis, right? So God creates human beings, puts them in the garden. They enjoy unbroken fellowship with him. They enjoy unbroken fellowship with each other. They're naked and they're not ashamed, right? They're walking around in esteem and honor. And they enjoy a good relationship with the creatures and the plants, right? They're provided for. They're exercising authority over the place that they live. And then obviously sin happens. And all of that gets distorted and broken, right? They hide from God. They are ashamed of their nakedness. They fight and bicker with each other. And we see that the ground itself is cursed. And interestingly enough, out of that curse comes this idea that work will be hard, that it will be hard work to take care of ourselves and provide for ourselves now. And even it specifically points to sweat as the fruit of the curse, which I think is kind of an interesting idea, right? That work before sin didn't have sweat involved in it. I don't even know what to make of that idea. I don't know how to process that, but that again, there was work for us to do, but it didn't involve sweating, right? That there was work for us to do, there was purpose, but somehow it was all joy and no pain, right? And again, when we run the story all the way out to the end, right? Scripture is really clear, and Scripture doesn't spend a ton of time getting into the details about what the future will look like. It paints in broad strokes, but one of those broad strokes is that there's still work for us to do. We will rule and reign with Christ, right? When heaven and earth merge together, when the kingdom comes in its fullness, we'll still actually have jobs. We'll still have work. There will still be purpose to our lives, right? And so Daniel lives in these in-between times where he's got work to do, he's got purpose, he's got vocation, but it's not always fun, right? And again, he's serving in the Babylonian kingdom, which probably wasn't what he envisioned, but also sometimes he's dealing with real threats to his own life or to the lives of his friends. And so I think probably all of that, I would imagine that all of that resonates with you as people of God who have to go work in the world, right? The idea that, oh yeah, there can be like this deep sense of joy and purpose in my work, and also it could just be like getting tossed to the lions by my boss every day too, right? It's like, okay, that's a good metaphor for what it's like to work. And I want to run through, we've pointed at these three themes in the book of Daniel over and over and over again, and I want to just think about this idea of work and the story of Daniel through the lens of these three themes, right? So the first theme is this idea of kingdoms in conflict, right? That there is God's kingdom. God is ultimately an authority over everything, but in his sovereignty and in his wisdom, he has allowed human beings to have authority and even to rebel against him if we choose to use it that way. And God has promised that he's going to set that right at some point in time, but he allows for there to be other kingdoms in conflict with his kingdom, right? And so I've worked a lot of jobs in my life. I've worked for McDonald's, worked for Domino's, worked for Walmart, worked for construction companies, and I've worked a lot of different jobs. I also work at a church now, right? And all of those different entities or jobs that I've had have had an interesting relationship to God's kingdom, right? So I worked for companies that they weren't necessarily set up in opposition to God, but they didn't really care about that. It's like, hey, we serve food to make money. That's just kind of what we do, right? I've also worked for Christian employers, right? I worked for a landscaping company, and the guy was a Christian. That was actually really crazy. So there was a small crew. This guy started in like the 1950s. He was old. So I worked for him in the early 2000s, and he'd been doing this for like 50 years. He was in his 70s. He'd run this small company his whole life. So it was kind of like his own personal little kingdom. He was, in many ways, very devout. He would share his faith with the guys on the crew, but then he would also cheat us out of our wages, and then like I show up as a Christian, he's like, "Oh, Steve, I'm going to put you in charge. You're going to be my foreman." And I was like, I don't know that I want that. So it was this really kind of weird place to be, of trying to navigate how do I be faithful in this place? And again, this was a godly man in many ways, and I don't think he saw himself as cheating his employees out of his wages. He was just kind of like doing what he had done in the 50s, but the laws had changed and he hadn't, right? And so, again, just this isn't quite the way this should work, right? And I would say, there are organizations, again, that have, like, their stated mission is making money, right? For whatever purposes. But then, even our church, we're an organization, we have a stated mission that I think is a good one, right? We have a mission that I think aligns with God's purposes and God's kingdom. But I'll be the first, we got several pastors, at least one of them is not perfect, right? So you can poll the other pastors in our church. But so what that means is that even this church is not the perfect iteration of God's kingdom on the earth. And whatever organization we work for or are part of, we're going to have to navigate, well, what does it look like for me to live in the midst of kingdoms that are in conflict, right? Where I might have a boss who doesn't actually want to serve God and is going to give me orders or give me tasks that may or may not line up with what I think God is calling me to do, right? And I'm going to have to figure out how to navigate that. And that's just a part of what it means to be God's people. And I think we see that so clearly in Daniel. And that brings us to this second theme of the book of Daniel, which is, in the words of Jesus, to be in the world but not of it, right? And Daniel really does this well, right? And so to be in the world is to be in Babylon and to be good at being in Babylon. And Daniel does, he's like the best Babylonian politician in the history of Babylon, right? And yet that's not ultimately what he might have chosen for himself, right? It's not ultimately where his ultimate allegiance lies. And man, I had this picture in my head that kind of helped me think through this idea. I think everybody in the room is familiar with Superman, right? And the basic story of Superman, right? So Superman is a superhero, but he wants to keep his identity secret. So what's his like public face? Clark Kent, right? Clark Kent of course, has a job as a reporter, right? And so I was thinking about that kind of like that picture of having like dual allegiances. And Clark Kent he's not trying to be a bad reporter. He's trying to be a good reporter, right? I think he's actually a photographer. Is that his job? I don't know. It's probably different in different iterations. Anyway, I'm not a big Superman fan. Sorry if you are. But that picture of somebody who is showing up to work, right? So this is somebody who can fly, who has like X-ray vision and all of these kinds of things. But he's just showing up to work to like take good pictures. And his boss yells at him and is nasty, and but he's still having to like go to work and navigate that. But also he's there for a different purpose, right? Does that make sense? And for me, that was like a really good picture of what I see with Daniel and what I think ultimately it looks like for us to be in the world but not of it, is to be somebody who, I'm going to be a good journalist because that's my job, and I'm not going to be a bad one. As a matter of fact, in Daniel's case, his worst enemies couldn't find anything wrong with his ability to do his job. This is an incredibly skilled person, a wise person, a good person, who is living out his faith in that way, and yet he also has this other kind of pseudo-secret identity. With Superman, it's secret. With Daniel, it's not secret, right? And with us, it's not secret. And matter of fact, I heard one of you in the room today shared a story with me this week about working in a fairly secular environment, and being not shy about faith, but also not throwing faith in people's faces. And just this week had some friends from work invite themselves over to this person's house because they had questions about their faith, right? Like, so you're one of those Christians. Tell me more about that, right? And it happened to be a same-sex couple who had invited themselves over and had kind of ended the conversation with, hey, like, we just really appreciate the way you have lived out your faith in front of us. And we know you may or may not agree with these things or those things about the way we live our life, but we really appreciate the way you're living out your faith and the way that you treat us and the way that you love us as a coworker, right? And I don't know, that's kind of like the way it's supposed to be, right? Wouldn't that be cool if, like, how many of you guys would like to sign up for that, where your coworkers were inviting themselves over to your house to ask you about your faith, right? That'd be pretty cool. Hey, like, can you tell us about Jesus? Because we want to know. You seem like one of the good ones, right? And so, but like, this is Daniel, right? This is what Daniel is doing. So apparently for his whole time in Babylon, he wasn't standing on the street corner telling people, to get right or get left or to turn or burn or anything like that. Although there were some times and places where he had some pretty hard messages specifically for the king, right? But also he wasn't shy about his faith, right? He prayed to Jerusalem, as was his habit, in an open window where people could see him, right? In his home, but also where people could see him. So his faith is on display. He's a man of God. And this is a part of his witness, right? And so I think that points at this third theme of Daniel, which we have continued to use the word mysticism, right? Daniel's a very mystical book, and we're going to turn the corner into some of that as we get into the later chapters, where it's just a bunch of dreams and interpretations. But we've already had some of that, right? And we see clearly that Daniel has this deep sense of, like, the transcendent presence of God in his life, right? And even just pointing towards this habit of prayer that he has points towards the fact that Daniel not only has this experience of God's presence, but he's cultivating it. He's looking for it, right? He's built it into the habits of his life. And, I wouldn't necessarily say that as a church we need to start praying in our open windows facing Jerusalem, right? We don't have to do that. But we should find those practices that are open doors to God's Spirit. Right? We have to create room in our life for God to speak to us if we want to hear his voice. We have to create room in our life for God to interact with us if we want him to do that, right? And I mean, you guys, it's pretty straightforward, like, read the book, say your prayers, but there's lots of different ways that we can do that, and lots of different ways to read the Bible and interact with it, lots of different ways to pray or to worship or to gather together or to serve or to sacrifice or to give or to fast or to celebrate, or, like, there's all of these different habits that we can build into our lives that create room for God to be with us. And that's the thing that allows Daniel to do what he does, right? Daniel is able to be the best Babylonian bureaucrat in the history of Babylon in the name of God and navigate that so well, those, like, crazy mixed allegiances, because he's somebody who's connected to God, right? Let's see. One last slide. So this, I guess I'm mindful of the fact that when we talk about, like, vocation and purpose and work within the context of the church, like, people are in all different places about that. Like, some people have a real clear sense of God's calling on their lives. It's like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to do this. And maybe that lasts your whole life, right? And there's certainly struggle in that, but there's joy in that, and there's clarity in that, right? So that's, many of you in this room, I think, are probably in that place. There's also people for whom this is kind of like a pressing, painful question. It's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life. And maybe, when you're 15, that doesn't matter so much, but as you get older, it starts to become like, well, am I spinning my wheels? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing, right? And even, I'm going to pick on my wife without permission, but don't worry, it's not crazy. But I think for you, there was a period in your life where you had a job outside of what we did in planting a church that felt like, well, I'm just supposed to treat that like a way to make money, and then real calling and ministry is inside the church, but that God has spoken to you over the last few years that, like, for those of you guys who don't know, Tammy's a nurse, and that actually is an important part of what God has put you on the earth to do, right, is to be a nurse. And so there's ways that, maybe we think that our calling is one thing and God redirects us or gives us clarity in later on about what we're supposed to be doing. So, I think people are in lots of different places when it comes to this question of, purpose and calling. But I got this picture up here of the ingredients for some pasta and some sauce, because I think it's a good picture of what is so clearly a biblical theme, both in the Old Testament, but especially in the New Testament, of this idea that all of us have gifts and abilities, right? All of us have something to bring to the table, whether you're the garlic or the tomatoes or the pasta or the pepper or the basil or whatever it is that you bring. You have something to offer, right? Some insight or some capacity to love or some capacity for some sort of skill, and that what God is asking us to do is to actually bring that and invest that in the work that is the work of his kingdom, right? And I think there's 4 different ways that I think that can look specifically within the context of this idea of work, right? Okay, I've got work to do. And the first way that I think we can invest is just at the most basic level. So whether you're an artist professionally or a teacher or a politician or a business person or an architect or a professor, whatever it is that you are, the most basic way that I think as believers we can see our work as a part of God's kingdom is just by being good people, right? Even setting aside the requirements of the job. Are we moral? Are we honest? Are we loving our neighbors? Are we generous? Are we faithful? Are we even actually taking opportunities to share our faith in appropriate ways when they arise? Just at the level of, am I aiming at godliness and righteousness in my work? Do my coworkers, would they be tempted to invite themselves over to my house to ask me why I'm one of the good ones and tell me about my faith in Jesus, right? Is that even something that might happen? And so that's just the first thing, but it's far from the only thing, right? So whether you make widgets or paint paintings or write books or publish books or teach classes or build houses, whatever it is that you do, those things are good things in and of themselves, right? People need lawyers. People need doctors because those are things that they need in their lives. And people need politicians and bureaucrats. I'm probably the first one to think that we don't, but we actually do. I recognize that we do. And so that's this second way that in and through our work, we can really just honor and serve God, is to be good at something, be good at what we do, whatever it is, right? If your job is, clerical, be really good at it because people need it, and it actually is a way of loving and serving those around us to be good at our work, right? Because these are things that, and I would say, so I wrestled with this. I don't know, I don't think I mentioned it this morning, but many of you know that I worked for the cable company for many years when we were planting the church, and I really struggled working for the cable company with whether or not I was actually providing a good and a service that was good for society. So I will say, if you find yourself doing a job where you're like, oh no, I'm actually what I'm providing to people is harmful, then maybe you should step out of that, right? But if you're producing something of value to people, whether it's spiritual or physical or artistic or material, that's a good thing, right? But then I also think there's a third way that people can use their work or their skills or their abilities, and that's inside the church. And that could be literally inside our congregation, within the Buffalo Vineyard Church, but it also could be the wider church, right? So if you're an artist, what does it look like to help the church think well and engage well and do good art, right? Or to see how the church can actually engage the world of artists or the broader culture through the medium of art for the sake of God's kingdom, right? And you could ask that same question for for architects and doctors and teachers. Like how can you help inform the church with your skills and your abilities and your insights and your expertise, right? And I'll just say, for me personally, I've been so blessed and enriched as a pastor by the way leaders in very different disciplines have coached me in how to lead. It's been absolutely life-changing for me to have people who are not pastors, who are not church leaders, help me understand some of the gifts and skills and abilities and tools from, whether it's business or other places, and it's just been really helpful for me, right? And so, that's a part of the way that we can use our work to advance God's kingdom. And then the last is the fourth kind of bucket or way that we could think about using our abilities and our calling as our work to advance God's kingdom is to do that same thing in the world, right? And so, not everybody in the room you're not all employing people, and maybe you never will employ people as over the course of your life. But one of the things that I've seen is business people or business owners who, out of their Christian conviction, will take risks on employees, right? Hey, this is a person that may or may not actually be a good employee for me, but I actually know that I can do something for them or in the community by hiring this person and giving them a job and really investing extra into helping them figure out how to make this job work, right? And that's one example, but so if you're an artist, maybe you're not going to do that, right? If you're a teacher, maybe you're not going to do that. But what does it look like within, to be a teacher who's not just teaching kids, but also thinking about education as a whole and thinking about our school systems and thinking about how they can be more just and just better at loving kids and building a better world, right? And so I think those are 4 ways that all of us should be thinking about, all right, so these are my skills, these are the things that God has given me to do with my life. How do I just do them as a godly person, but also do them well? And also think about how I can bring that into the church, and also think about how I can actually use that to shape the world, right? And I think, coming back to Daniel and this story, man, I feel like Daniel is a great example of that, right? Of somebody who, not doing necessarily what he chose to do, but what God chose for him to do, who, he brought what he had to bear. He was as wise as he could be, as courageous as he could be, as godly as he could be, as faithful as he could be, right? And man, his light shone brightly, right? Maybe the last thing to share. So while we were praying this morning before the service, Zach had a picture of a diamond, and just Zach could explain what he saw more clearly, but just the idea that a diamond starts in a lump of coal, right? And so first of all, a diamond is formed under intense heat and pressure, but then also when you find a diamond, you've got to cut parts of it off and polish it to make it look like something beautiful. And I think that's a picture of Daniel's story, but also I think it's both an admonition and an encouragement to us, right? So we see God at work and God shine through. Daniel's witness in many ways is the brightest, specifically in those places where he's experiencing the most hardship, right? Where things are the most difficult. And it's not because he's, picking fights with people. It's not that kind of hardship, right? He's not seeking out hardship, but he's also not avoiding it, and he's not running from it, and he's not assuming that God is punishing him because of it, but rather he's standing as faithfully as he can in the midst of really painful, difficult, scary circumstances, and it's precisely in those places where God is shining through his life. So yeah, hopefully that's an encouragement to you as you think about the work that God has called you to do. So I think, did I put some reflection questions on there? I think I did, yes. Yeah, so we'll take a couple of minutes and just ask God to help us reflect and to speak to us, and maybe there's an opportunity for you to pray for somebody or receive prayer before we go. But that question of what has God given you to share? And maybe you have clarity around calling and work, maybe you don't. but what is it that God has given you to give away to others? Maybe it's some skill, maybe it's some specific capacity to love or take care of people or whatever that is. And then what is it that gets in the way of that, right? What is it that, and you can start by reflecting and then just talking to God and listening to God about those things. So we just pray that you would come, Holy Spirit, and help us to see clearly, to understand, to hear your voice. Teach us how to pray in this moment, God. And we pray that you'd have your way in us. So I think the way that we're going to finish up this morning, instead of me giving you guys a benediction, is I do want to give you guys an opportunity to give or receive prayer. So if God's stirring something up in you that you feel like you want some prayer for, if you came in with somebody that you want to just turn to and ask them to pray for you, do that. If you're by yourself or you don't trust the person next to you, I'm just joking. But if you're by yourself and you're like, yeah, I actually want somebody to pray for me, you can just raise your hand and one of our leaders will come pray with you. But we're just going to kind of like hang out and be quiet. Maybe, I don't know, if you guys want to turn up a little mood music, and if you guys want to leave, you don't want to stick around, you can do that. But we'll take the next few minutes and just, if God stirred something up in you this morning and you want somebody to pray for you about that, ask for prayer. Again, turn to the person next to you and ask for prayer, or raise your hand and somebody will come and pray with you. And everybody else, you're dismissed to quietly leave.